All right, folks, it is exactly 6:30. I'm so excited. I'm so excited for Earth Day every day to be back. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Earth Day, our Earth Day Everyday webinar series. I'm Michelle Backus. I'm with Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Middlesex and Union County. And we are kicking off tonight our spring Earth Day Everyday series. And we are so thrilled that so many of you are with us today. I'm going to make some announcements and try to kick it off to Angela as quickly as possible. First of all, I want to let you know that we are recording this evening. So if you've been with us before, then you know the deal, but we will explain. We are with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Rutgers Cooperative Extension is the outreach arm of Rutgers University. There is a Rutgers Cooperative Extension office in every county in the state. Soon, even we even have Hudson County coming online very, very soon. So that's very exciting. So if you have questions that you need answered pertaining to really anything having to do with horticulture, farming, food and nutrition, youth development, we answer lots of questions for the public, and we provide science-based knowledge to the public on a whole host of issues. The purpose of this particular webinar series is we started almost a year ago, 11 months ago, right at the height of COVID, at the beginning of COVID. And we wanted to help folks learn what they can be doing, simple actions that they can be doing at home to help protect the environment. All of our sessions from last year are online on the Earth Day, the Rutgers Earth Day Everyday website. So you can go through those and see and listen to those recordings. Tonight we are using Zoom to engage with you. And last year we had a very kind of open forum, lots of chatting in the chat box, but unfortunately we've had a lot of issues at Rutgers with Zoom bombing, so we've kind of had to tighten that up. So you will not be able to see each other's questions, but I can see your questions. So go ahead and put any questions that you have in the chat box. You should be able to see the chat box on, if you're using a computer or an iPad, on the bottom of the screen has a little call out window. If you're on a cell phone, then you may have to click on like more or something like that to get to the chat, but that's where you should put your questions. Everyone is muted, and you probably can't start your video also. That's because of our Zoom security measures. At the end of this session, about 10 minutes before the end of this session, we are going to open up a poll for you to answer some questions for us. And then I also want to make sure that you know that if you want to, you can donate to the Rutgers Environmental Stewards Program. That's part of the program. That's one of the partners on the Earth Day Everyday webinar series. And I will put that information in the chat so that you have it, or if Amy and Steve are able to do that, you can do that too. So you can, if you like this programming and want more of it, you can donate. You can donate to our program. Before I turn it over to Angela, I want to explain this incredibly wordy slide. You are now all considered research subjects by the university. This has some information about consent to take part in what Rutgers considers this to be a research study. Just know that this is totally voluntary. All it means is that you are sitting through this webinar, and then you're going to answer some questions at the end. We ask that you answer questions through the poll at the end, and you can choose to ignore those questions if you'd like. And then in about 6 to 12 months, we'll follow up with you to just see if you've adopted any of the actions that we talked about in this webinar series. And you can ignore that also if you would like, but this is part of our responsibilities for the Rutgers Human Subjects Compliance. Okay, hopefully I did that fast. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Angela Monaghan, who is the Master Gardener Coordinator for Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Middlesex County. Angela is a graduate of Rutgers University and has a degree in plant science. She is my go-to for all things all things plants and all things native plants. And tonight she's going to be talking to you about starting a native plant garden and building plant communities. Angela also did a session for us in the fall. She did a session for us on starting native plants from seed. So you can go back and you can listen to that fabulous recording that she did. So I'm going to turn it over to Angela. Angela, I see that yellow writing on the screen. I'm not sure. I've seen these kinds of things happen before where someone takes a pen to their iPad or something like that, and somehow it gets loaded up. If you do have an iPad, pen, or pencil out there and you're writing on the screen, you may want to stop.
Sarah.
It's not too distracting.
It's fine. I really don't care.
Okay.
But anyway, hi everybody. So like Michelle said, I'm going to be talking about starting native plant garden with you, and more importantly, building native plant communities. So we're going to discuss and how we can build plant communities within your landscape at home. Okay, so here's the outline. We're going to do a quick introduction / recap on native plants. We're going to talk about your garden site assessment, basic design principles of a native plant community, finding the best native plants for your yard, and providing resources for pollinators and other beneficial creatures in your garden. So to begin, we're going to define native. Native plants are plants that were living on this continent before European settlers arrived. So that was given to us by the New Jersey Native Plant Society, who is a great resource. Michelle and I were discussing earlier about how great their conference was this past weekend. They're a great resource, and I also have a references page that I'll be giving to Michelle to share with you, and their website is a great resource. So native plants here before European settlers arrived, they've adapted to the climate, to their ecosystem, and they are kind of integrated into our ecology. So why are native plants so great? They're drought tolerant for one. They're adapted to our ecosystem. They can protect soil resources. They are low maintenance. They will attract and support wildlife. You don't need to fertilize them, so that's less inputs all around. And they also improve water quality by filtering water into the aquifer. And they're beautiful in any style of garden. So just a quick, so just a quick taxonomy lesson. Taxonomy basically is the classification of organisms. We do this in science because we're humans and we need to put everything in a little category. So binomial nomenclature is the wording system that creates two words in order to name an organism. For example, common purple coneflower is Echinacea purpurea. It's a Latin name. It's kind of funny sounding, right? But it's always italicized or underlined. And the genus, which is Echinacea, is capitalized, whereas the species is lowercase, and that's purpurea. And what's really important for gardeners is to know, the family, the genus, and the species. And the family really gives you an overview of who is kind of in that family and how different plants kind of relate and different morphologies of the plant. And then the genus is kind of an overarching section of the plant, and then species gets even more specific on the morphology of the plant. So a cultivated species or a cultivated variety is a variety that has had human interaction. So cultivated meaning humans have taken two plants, they've crossed them by standard breeding practices, and any sort of cultivated variety will have a singular quote around the name. So Echinacea purpurea, as we'll talk about a little bit later, has over 100 cultivated varieties, and one is called powwow berry. So that's in single quotes. Like I said, organism hierarchy, you should really know family, genus, and species to know how different plants can relate. So why is this important? It's important because you'll come to find out that different species will be better suited to your yard than other species. Some species like it more sunny, some like a little more shade, some will want a little more moisture, and some may like it dry. So within the genus, you could have a ton of different species that can be adapted to different site conditions. This also helps with plant ID. So different morphologies of the plant will lend itself to for you to know which exact species that you're seeing. And it's also really good to know what you're buying because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, knowing whether it's a cultivated variety versus a straight species may be really important. So let's talk a little bit about ecotype or provenance. So ecotype is plants that are specific to an ecological region and may differ randomly in characteristics throughout the range of the species. So like I said, different species may even vary within its own species. So if it's, so say, okay, Solidago cassia, we just learned that New Jersey Native Plant Society named this the plant of the year. I love Solidagos. They're common, they're goldenrod, and there's all different types of species. I love it particularly because in the late fall, it's one of the last bloomers. I see it a lot in the sand dunes, and monarch butterflies love it. And it's great, especially in Cape May and all of our migration sites along the coast where monarchs can just feed on the nectar and get enough energy to move on south to Mexico. So Solidago has a special place in my heart. So wreath goldenrod is one that is a little bit lower growing. It's probably a little bit better for some garden sites, and it can change. It can be kind of the characteristics of it can kind of change throughout the range. So you can see to the right here, you see that it's native range. So the native range is all in green to the right, and then the lime green is where it's specific to certain counties where it's found. So if you go down to the bottom here, you can kind of see New Jersey, and the lime green is where it's been found growing native, just wild in those counties. So you kind of see Monmouth County, Ocean County, Cape May, some northern counties that I'm not so familiar with, maybe Sussex, Essex, and the actual species can be different if it's found, at the beach or in the highlands. So it's really interesting, and that kind of is important when you're buying seeds or plants, because it might, if you have a species or an ecotype that's grown in your county, it might be better suited to maybe your sandy soil as opposed to one that was grown in the northern counties that maybe was grown in more of a moist, kind of rich soil. This is important, but different species can be adapted, and if you do find a plant that was grown at a nursery that was, say, up north, and maybe you're kind of in central Jersey, it can still be planted and be okay. But so some different examples of varying characteristics in an individual species may be plant height, growth habits, maturation rates, so that means when it goes to seed, leaf appearance, and reproductive habits. A lot of times too, soil plays a really big factor, and sunlight as well. Excuse me. Okay, so let's talk about straight species versus cultivars. They've kind of made this funny name called nativars to describe native cultivars. So it's native plus cultivar, cultivated variety. They've called it nativars. So plants can vary. Plants can vary in leaf and flower color, in size, disease resistance. So these cultivated varieties have been selected to produce different traits, so different characteristics. And there's a really big debate going on. Are straight natives better than nativars? there's there's a lot of people that'll say yes, a lot of people will say no. The straight species, as you can see here in the top right, that's Echinacea purpurea. And it's a great nectar flower for a lot of butterflies and bees. You can kind of see the petals here, and actually the flowers are kind of that cone shape right in the middle, and that's where the nectary is, so that butterflies and bees can get into that area and kind of feed off that site. Then you have a cultivated variety or nativar called green jewel. This is a totally different color, and it may not be so great for bees and butterflies because they may not know that this is an echinacea. So we'll talk a little bit later about why flower color or petal color is very important. So if you have this planted in your garden, you may not get the same amount of species coming to your garden. Then on the bottom left-hand side, you see Echinacea purpurea pink double delight. And this can be an issue because you really don't have those flower nectaries that you see on the straight species. Instead, you have a lot of petals, and the bees or the butterflies can't really get in there into the nectaries and actually feed. So that can be an issue, although it's very attractive. It can be an issue for pollinators. And then the bottom right, Echinacea purpurea magnus is a beautiful, and it looks just like the straight species, right? The problem with magnus is that it's a sterile variety. So it's been bred so that when the seed drops, it won't produce offspring. So that means it's sterile. It won't produce offspring. And so that's an issue because then it doesn't produce any pollen. So you're not feeding any bees or butterflies with the pollen. So they're going to kind of expend their energy on that variety, thinking it's a straight species of echinacea. Oh, I love the echinacea. This is great and tasty. But then when they go and kind of move their bodies and try to get those pollen or nectar sources, they're not going to find anything. So they're not going to be able to feed. So that's kind of the issue with nativars. But there are some really pretty nativars out there. And so, if you really do like some of the nativars, I would say, maybe plant one or two, but try to really plant the straight species. Other reasons why nativars would be good would be for height. So some nativars may be more compact, like winterberry holly has some more compact cultivars that might be more beneficial for a landscape setting. But there are a lot of really great straight species out there, and like we'll talk about in a little bit, you really have to know what your site is, where you're planting, in order to fit proper plants in there. All right, this is a native plant public service announcement. Never, never, never source native plants from the wild. If you dig them up, they will likely die from transplant shock, and it's also illegal. So if you try to dig up native plants from, say, a national park or even a county or state park, you could essentially be arrested or fined, and that's not good. So another negative outcome, you'll have a dead plant in your landscape when you go home because of transplant shock, and then another plant has kind of disappeared in the wild and it can't proliferate. So you ideally would like to select plants from reputable local nurseries, and you would want to select seed or transplants, and make sure that when you are looking at your plants and you're selecting plants at a nursery, or even if you order them through the mail, you want to make sure that there aren't any diseases or insects, because that way, if you do plant plants with disease and insects in your garden, that can spread. So just make sure that you look over your plants. This even applies to if you're at a nursery and you're selecting vegetable or other flowers. So just making sure that there aren't any diseases or pests on those transplants. And then it is okay to collect some seed of wild populations, but you really want to do this sparingly. Ideally, you want to go to a nursery and get native seed, clean seed from a reliable source. But if you do tend to find a population in say, a roadside or your friend's friend's yard, that would be okay. But you can't, again, take anything from a national or state park. They do say leave no trace, and they don't want you to take anything from the national or state park. And so any sort of wild seed collected, you want to do so sparingly, maybe only from one pod or like of one plant, and you don't want to collect all of them, because then the plant won't be able to reproduce and the population will not be able to grow at that site. So let's take a garden site assessment. So you're thinking about starting a native plant garden. This is great. That's why you're here, right? So we want to think about the right plant for the right place. And this is really important because you want the plant to be successful, right? You really want to consider your surroundings. Do you live in a wooded area? Are you at the beach? An open meadow type situation? Really take note of where you are. Brand new, are you planning a brand new garden, or would you like to incorporate native plants into an existing bed? If you're planning on incorporating native plants into an existing bed, also take note of which plants are already placed there. Are they already native plants, or are they more exotic plants that are from another region of the world? You want to make sure that you know where those plants are in relation to where you'd like to plant your new native plants. Are you considering the front yard or your backyard? You really want to consult HOA or local regulations. I know some planned communities do not, they have a strict set of rules. So you really want to make sure before you go planting anything that you're adhering to those local regulations. And then wildlife is definitely going to be a factor, especially in New Jersey. So you really want to think about which plants, do your research, think about which plants are deer resistant. And then also in new plantings, if you have a bunny issue in your yard, you might want to do like a little short fence around the new plantings just so that they get established. And then you can kind of take the fence down and they should be okay. And if you have a really bad deer issue, consider fencing. For this talk, Amy and I were talking about fencing, and it can be very expensive, but if you have a small enough property, you can fence your area off so that you don't have as much of an issue with deer. You also would have to consider planting deer-resistant plants, and there are deer-resistant plants out there. I'm not going to say that there are plants that deer will not like at all, because if deer are hungry enough, they'll eat anything. I've seen them eat hollies, which who wants to eat a thorny holly tree? I have no idea, but they do because they're hungry enough. Or you could also incorporate a liquid fence. Liquid fence are very stinky, even to humans, but they give off a smell that will keep away rodents and deer. So you could also try that. And some are organic, so if you're into that, it's a good thing. And also consider aesthetics. Planting native pollinator gardens, they tend to be more on the informal side. An informal garden, there's more curvy lines, it's more naturalist looking. And so just kind of be aware of that, because some people think that they're messy, but we can talk a little bit more about how to kind of create more of a curb appeal to your native plantings. And then you just want to consider this when you're planting. All right, so more things to consider for your garden site assessment. Sunlight. Sunlight is one of the biggest factors to consider. So wherever you're thinking of planting in your yard, how much sun does the site get? Is it full sun, which is 6 or more hours of sunlight, partial sun, which is more 3 to 6 hours, or shade, which tends to be less than 3 hours? This is really important to consider, because you really can't plant something like echinacea in full shade. You're really going to have to do your research and find out which plants can tolerate, full shade if that's the site that you have. Soil moisture, that's a huge factor in choosing your plants, because if you have dry soil, moist, or a really wet site, there are certain plants that you can plant versus others. And a really good way to test your soil texture is called the ribbon test. And you can see here on the photo, this person took a handful of soil and they're kind of pushing the soil through their forefinger and their thumb. And what happens is when it's moist, it creates a ribbon, and that kind of gives you an idea of how much clay is in your soil. So if it's that kind of looks to me like there's a decent amount of clay in that soil, maybe not full clay, but it looks pretty clay-like. So this is really important to know because some plants will like a clay soil and others may like more sand. So you really have to know what your soil texture is in order to choose the best plants for your site. So really get into the soil and really feel it and kind of figure out what you have. Another way to determine your soil conditions would be to test your soil. Rutgers offers soil testing kits. If you visit the website, you can download the survey and answer the questionnaire about your garden site. It is two-sided, so just make sure that you answer both sides of the question form. And this will really help to determine the soil's characteristics, especially the pH, which is very important for specific plants. Some plants, like blueberries, love very acidic soil. Whereas others may not tolerate such an acidic soil. So knowing your pH is very important when you choose your plants. And also it'll give you your nutrient levels, which for native plants isn't as necessary because native plants are kind of suited to our region, to our area, so they can kind of tolerate a wider range of soils. But if you do have a very acidic soil, you would want to choose plants that are, that can tolerate more acidity. So knowing that is very important. And then, like we said before, soil texture, whether it be sandy, clay, or loam, can also be tested. So that is an additional fee in the soil testing questionnaire. But if you are unsure and you really want to know what your soil texture is, they can tell you what that is. Okay, so let's kind of talk about the design principles of a native plant community. So when we're planting this garden, I really want you to think about how the different plants are going to relate to each other. So we're thinking about building this community of plants. And so it's not that we're gonna just plant a new plant in one place and maybe another plant here and another plant there. We want to make sure that these plants are able to interact appropriately with one another and that they're given the site that they need the most in order to thrive. So, like we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, we want to determine the environmental conditions of your yard. So kind of overall looking at the yard and all the conditions. And then we really think about letting the site's kind of constraints set you free. If you have a clay lawn or clay yard, choosing plants that are best suited for clay. Layering up. So we're going to talk about how we're going to layer plants by height. And we also want to kind of make it pretty. I don't subscribe to things need to be pretty, but when you have local ordinances and HOAs that are breathing down your neck, you kind of want to make it look good, right? And management over maintenance. So we'll talk about how native plant communities will be more so managed over maintained. So here we are, we want to determine the environmental conditions of our yard. So we want to choose plants that grow together in a specific type of habitat. And the habitat's going to kind of be your contributing factors as far as what, your soil and site conditions. So what type of ecosystem do you live in? Like I said, do you live at the beach? Do you live in a wooded area? Kind of take that into consideration when you're choosing your plants and you're designing. What's naturally growing in your yard? My husband and I moved into our house about a year ago, and we're kind of close to the beach, so actually have really bad fill soil in our backyard, but it's very sandy, and I've noticed that there are a lot of sassafras and hollies that are just growing wild. So that kind of gives me an idea of which plant communities or how to build a plant community. So I want to look at plants that grow along with hollies and oaks and sassafras, and how they can kind of interact with each other and balance each other out. So those type of things, knowing what's kind of growing in your yard can kind of give you clues as to what other plants that you should plant into your yard. And then also go and observe some local plant communities. You can visit local parks and woodland trails or preserved open fields and kind of take note as to what's growing. This here's a picture of liatris and some other herbaceous forbs growing in a pine forest clearing. Okay, so let the site's constraints set you free. We're kind of thinking as stress as an asset. You're kind of playing to the site's strengths and limitations. So is it shady? Great, all right. Clay, awesome. Boggy, no problem. The plant selection will become more specialized as you kind of adhere to these different limitations, almost, so to speak, of your site. And there are plants for every condition. You just have to do a little bit of research and find out what's good for your site. And like I said, there are a couple things you need to take note of. So your site assessment, again, kind of going back to that and thinking, what's your soil like, moisture, and light. Those are three really important factors when considering your site. And then you also want to create a sense of place. So you kind of want to enhance where you live and kind of your ecosystem. So creating a sense of place kind of helps you kind of set the scene. And so, you know, if you live in a wooded area, you don't necessarily want to plant tropical annuals because it kind of doesn't really fit. If you're in an oak pine forest and you're planting, you know, calla lilies, you know, it can look good for sure, but it doesn't necessarily fit into that ecosystem. So kind of thinking about a sense of place when you're planting and choosing plants. We want to layer up. So we really want to plant in layers. And this can kind of be, I don't want to say difficult, but this can kind of be a challenge, I guess, when you're considering about different plants and how to plant them. So you want to kind of use your structural layers. That's going to be your big trees or your shrubs, or maybe your really tall herbaceous perennials like Joe Pyeweed. Those are kind of like the backbone of your planting. And then that's kind of, we'll call that your canopy, maybe your trees and your bigger shrubs. And then you have more of like a shrub layer. So that'll be a little bit shorter. So maybe if you have some winterberry holly that you'd like to plant, it's a very nice evergreen, or maybe some viburnums, you know, some of the smaller ones would be more your shrub layer. And then, like I said, you want to kind of think about taller herbaceous plants like your Joe Pyeweed. Those get very, very tall, 6 feet or so. And like I said, those are more like the structural layer. And then you can incorporate your seasonal theme layer. So these are the plants that are going to kind of change as the seasons progress. So thinking about plants that bloom in the spring and the summer and the fall. And this kind of creates a year-round interest. In your structural layer, you might choose to incorporate some winterberry hollies, and that would create winter interest. Some of your trees, like a river birch or something, has a really great texture to the bark. So kind of thinking past what the flowers look like, and then also thinking about what these other contributions these plants can give you to your garden. So like I said, so going back to the seasonal theme layer, so choosing plants that bloom at different times. And then what's really important is to kind of create this ground cover layer. And I'm not talking about English ivy. No. English ivy is invasive. We don't want English ivy. But there are some really great ground covers that are native that you can incorporate into your garden. And this will help a lot with weed suppression, which I know everybody has an issue with. No one really likes to weed. I mean, I kind of do, but I'm a little weird. So there are ground covers out there, or, you know, lower plants that will help cover the soil, because in the wild, there's really no bare soil. If you think about it, look, you know, when next time you're out on your trails, you're hiking, look around. There really isn't any bare soil. If there aren't plants there, there's leaf litter. So any so plants will find a way, and if there's a chance for a plant to grow, it's going to take that opportunity and it's going to grow in that bare soil. If a tree falls, something's going to grow in its place. We want to use green mulch, like I said, with the ground covers, and this will help reduce weed invasion. We want to think about plant spacing and, again, different bloom times, which are really important to kind of create that seasonal interest. And thinking about different plant forms. Are plants more upright? Are they more sprawling? Do they sprawl across the ground? And then also kind of consider what the roots are doing. We don't see the roots, but they're there. And they definitely play a huge factor in the plant's interactions with each other. So something like a tree is going to have, it can have wide spreading and deep tap roots, whereas something like a Joe Pye weed is going to have very deep tap roots. Some certain things like grasses have more fibrous or rhizomatous roots, which are which are pretty shallow in the soil layer. So by thinking about the different heights of the plant above ground and how deep the roots go below ground, we can kind of plant and make sure the plants kind of interact with each other in those two ways. And also kind of think about which dominant tree or shrub species are common in your neighborhood. Like I said, we have oak, we have hollies, the American holly, and in my backyard, I have a lot of sassafras. So I'm going to kind of play to that. And I'm really excited for my yard personally because it's kind of a blank canvas and I can do a lot with it. So hopefully in the future, I'll be able to give you a presentation on my native plant experience. Okay, so let's make it pretty. So aesthetics kind of equals acceptance in the native plant sense. Like I said, a lot of native plants get a bad rap about being messy. So we want to try to, do some things and incorporate some different structures in order to kind of make it look clean. We kind of talked about what an informal garden is. So it's more relaxed. There's more it's more asymmetrical, so maybe you'll have something short here, maybe something tall here, and there's a lot of really nice soft curves, whereas a formal garden is more geometric, so a lot of times not sharp edges, squares or different geometric patterns are incorporated. Kind of think boxwood and how you can really prune them to kind of look like a box. A lot of things are very symmetrical, so it's even on both sides, and there's a lot of straight lines. So kind of if you're trying to look to make a native plant garden look formal, some different techniques that you can do is to kind of frame that native plant garden. So you're kind of trying to create order, which is hard. Order in general in life is difficult, but by incorporating a mowed lawn edge to kind of create that clean edge look, and then also hardscaping, you can create like a mini wall. You can use some pathways or fences or even a clipped edge. Again, you can get that boxwood, which not native, but Ilex glabra, again, is another really great boxwood alternative, and you can hedge that to make it look kind of boxy. So you can kind of incorporate some of these techniques to make this messy looking native garden into something that's more tamed. And thinking about when you're going out into a meadow or a woodland and you're kind of seeing all these different native plants. Well, you don't have to incorporate every single native plant, but your native garden community is going to be more of a distillation of the native plant community beyond your garden. So maybe you're choosing a few plants here and there to kind of incorporate into your garden. You don't have to bring the whole woods to your native plant garden. And then another really great point to make about aesthetics and making your garden look cohesive is planting in masses. So not just planting one plant of one species, not planting like one echinacea, but planting in odd numbers, in threes and fives, and planting in mass is very attractive when you're creating a native plant community, because For one, you're kind of seeing this whole mass, and it creates more of a spectacular effect when you have one species in mass. And then also it helps your pollinator friends to have more variety with and be able to kind of hop around to different plants so that they're able to feed more on the same species that's blooming at that time. We want to think about management over maintenance. I know you probably know some high maintenance people in your life. I am not one of them personally. And so I want to more so manage my gardens, and I don't want to have to intensively maintain them over the course of the year. So we're kind of thinking about what's good for one plant should be good for a lot of your plants in your garden. You know, roses are kind of the diva of the garden world, and they need a lot of care and a lot of maintenance, a lot of pruning, fertilizer, you know, pesticide sprays. I don't have time for that personally, but some of you might, and that's fine. You can have your rose garden, and then you could also incorporate native plants. Just know that you're going to spend maybe a little less time on your native plants, and that might give you more time to use in your rose garden. And you know, your native garden plant community garden is going to kind of change over time because change is the only constant. Things are going to move around, things are going to seed and self-seed, and maybe you planted something here one year and then you see it pop up over here the next year. So that's kind of the fun about planting a native plant community, in that you'll kind of see things move and evolve over time. And what's interesting about native plants is that they're dynamic, you know, and their native plant garden is always changing. And when you're thinking about planning your garden, you're not going to just have it be a one-time thing. This is kind of going to be like a series of decisions that you're going to make. Like I said, you know, some plants might not make it, and that's okay because gardening is an experiment. And so if the plant doesn't make it, then you know you want to try another plant in that space to see what works better. So you're always kind of moving with the plants and understanding how they work in your garden. Another thing about native plant gardens, like I said earlier, you're using a lot less water and you don't need any fertilizer. So the first year of planting your garden, you really want to make sure that you do water it just to establish the plants. But over time, you know, the next year or so, you really won't have to water your garden. And then spring cleaning is very important. So what differs from, you know, native plants versus maybe your vegetable garden is that you're going to do a spring cleaning. So like in a couple weeks, if you do have some native plants, that's when you want to kind of, you know, prune some of the dead branches, cut down your grasses and things like that, because in a native plant garden, you have a lot of pollinators and beneficial insects either hibernating underneath leaf litter, in the stems of hollow stems of plants, in grasses. And so you don't want to disturb their overwintering sites. They also lay their eggs in leaf litter and whatnot. So by waiting until the spring, you know, we like to say around like St. Patrick's Day or that weekend about, and that way you can, you know, that gives enough time for a lot of the soil to warm up and the critters to get active and move about. And so you're not disturbing their overwintering sites. And I think that's a really important thing to remember because we want to make sure that we're helping our beneficial insects. All right, so how do we find the best native plants for our yards? Again, we kind of want to look to our yard and our neighbors' yards and local parks for clues. Applying your site assessment is very important. So asking all those questions about soil, about your sunlight, and about the soil moisture level. Like I said, very important. And you don't want to just choose herbaceous plants. And what I mean by herbaceous plants are your flowering plants. Yes, they're very attractive. They're flowers. They're beautiful, right? But you also want to consider grasses, which create hiding and nesting sites for birds, and a lot of these smaller birds will hide in grasses from larger predatory birds. You also want to consider shrubs and trees. Again, the shrubs and the trees are kind of going to create that backbone of your native plant garden. And they also help they also help with birds as far as nesting sites, and oak trees are really great if you have oaks in your area or your yard, because they support a lot of different Lepidoptera or caterpillar species. And then you want, if you're interested in different wildlife, you want to kind of look for specific plants for specific wildlife. So there are different plants that will attract different birds or butterflies. And if you want to kind of see that in your landscape, you can plant those plants as long as they are suited for your soil and light requirements. And then again, varying bloom times, you're going to bring in different species of wildlife at different times, along with the bloom times of your plants. Here are some examples of really great databases. On my resource sheet, I listed all of the websites for some of these places. I love Jersey Friendly Yards. I think they have a really great plant database. Also, the Audubon Society is awesome because it lists the plants that are beneficial to specific birds. And then the National Wildlife Federation has a really great database, and you can type in your zip code. And if you want plants for a sandy soil, you can select that. And I love those two sites specifically if you're trying to attract specific wildlife. And then the New Jersey Native Plant Society also has a really cool interactive page where you can look at all the different native plant nurseries in the state. And I think they just upgraded that, because before they had an Excel spreadsheet, which was awesome, but this is even better. So I would recommend visiting those sites in order to find which plants are going to be best suited for your yard. All right, so my native plant guru, Christine Clemenson, is amazing. I worked at her native plant nursery years ago, and it's what really got me into native plants. And I wanted to share with you her Pull in the Pollinators Gardening for Wildlife checklist. So again, choosing a sunny location is helpful, but if you don't have a sunny location, that's also okay, because there are different pollinator plants that do require shade. So but just choosing a sunny location is a little bit more beneficial for butterflies, because they like that kind of warm sun. But anyway, give me shelter. So we want to kind of create some sort of like little area for pollinators or birds to kind of hide. So maybe like a brush pile or something, if you can kind of spare a little corner of your yard, that would help. Seasonal blooms, like I said, creating year-round interest. Plant in masses, we discussed that. Planting native ecotypes. Host with the most, we'll talk about what a host plant is. Providing water sources, fruit source. Plant grasses, encourage native bee habitats. Not all bees are going to live in a hive. That's mainly the honeybee. A lot of our native bees are ground bees and solitary bees that require different habitats. Also spring cleaning, we just talked about that. And try not to use pesticides. All right, let's talk real quick about plant selection. We want to consider your plant height and width and proper spacing between plants. You want them not to grow necessarily on top of each other, so that they're, how did I say this? So we don't want them growing over top of each other, but you want to give them enough space so that when they grow to their mature width, that they have enough space, but they're also kind of shading the soil so that they're not allowing weed seeds to grow. So that's a finesse type thing, and that kind of comes with experience and time and research. But then also kind of, again, going back to your site assessment and finding your soil type and the moisture level. Again, bloom time, plant for the changing seasons, and you want several species of plants to bloom at once. So you just don't want one plant blooming at one time. You want to kind of create a garden where you have 3 or 4 species kind of blooming at once. throughout the year. So that really gives the pollinators a lot of variety, something to choose from. Ecotype, again, plants local to the region, and grouping, planting in clumps to attract more pollinators. All right, again, with plant selection, flower color is very important. So if you're trying to attract butterflies, they really like red, yellow, oranges, pinks, and purples. And bees tend to like more blues, violets, whites, and yellows. So you can kind of see here at the bottom right, there's a little honeybee on Gaillardia, and that's called blanket flower, common name. And that's a nice low growing perennial that likes more so dry sites. The bees love it. And then to the right, left, I got that mixed up. To the left, you'll see a hummingbird feeding on Lonicera sempervirens, and that is your coral honeysuckle, which is a native honeysuckle. And you can kind of take note of the type of flower shape. And what's really important about the honeysuckle is it has a tubular flower. So the hummingbird has adapted over time with the coral honeysuckle to get that pollen nectar, which is like at the back of the throat, kind of like all the way back there. And it's able to use a little beak to get in there and to draw out the nectar and feed on that plant. So that's kind of a really important thing to consider if you're trying to attract hummingbirds. You might want to grow coral honeysuckle. Again, this genus and the species really matters because the genus, which is Lonicera, kind of encompasses a lot of different honeysuckle, but you want to make sure that you're getting sempervirens because there's Lonicera japonica, which you might see a lot of, and that's an invasive. That's kind of, I don't know if you guys all took the honeysuckle and sucked it when you were younger, but that's an invasive, unfortunately, and we don't want to plant that. And it's not beneficial to hummingbirds. And then, like you said, we also want to include trees, shrubs, vines, and grasses. And you can see to the right here, what we see is a yellow flower on the left. What bees and butterflies see is on the right. And so it is under UV light, and the plant is kind of telling the bee or the butterfly, hey, like, come right here. This is where the nectar is. And it aids the pollinator to show where the nectar is. Okay, so we want to use plants to provide various food sources. So we have host plants, and host plants serve as food for the larval stage. So that's your caterpillars. So like we said earlier, oaks probably has the highest variety of species that it helps provide food source for. The swallowtail butterfly larva, that really likes parsley and plants in the Apiaceae family. So a native of the parsley family would be Zizia, and that is a host plant for the swallowtail butterfly. So if you notice that all of your parsley is being eaten in the middle of the summer, that is don't spray. I've done that before, it was bad. But that's the swallowtail butterfly, and just kind of let it be, and maybe next year plant a little extra parsley for yourself. Also, monarch butterfly, its plant host is the common milkweed. So there's a couple other milkweed species that you can plant that can also be a host plant for the monarch butterfly caterpillar. And then we also want to consider nectar and pollen plants. So nectar is kind of the sugars and the vitamins. It's your high energy food for your pollinators. And then pollen is kind of like your protein and fat. So that's kind of your long-term energy stores. And so on the left here, a common buckeye on rattlesnake master, which is a Euringium. It's a really cool native plant. Check it out. And then on the right here is a bumblebee collecting pollen from partridge pea, which is an annual legume which fixes nitrogen in the soil. So if you have kind of a depletion of nitrogen in your soil, you could plant some partridge pea and it'll help build your soil. Michelle, do we want to talk about the poll?
Yes, thank you. Good timing. I'm also in the background, kind of trying to answer a million questions. So,
Oh, okay.
there's a lot coming for you.
All right, I'm ready for
Yes,
it.
folks, I'm going to open up a poll. Doesn't mean that we're done. It just, I want to give you a little time to fill it out. So, okay. So you should see it pop up on your screen, and you can get started on those questions. Go ahead, Angela.
Okay. So garden accessories. We want to kind of incorporate some things for plants, or for some things for pollinators, to help sustain them. So using flat stones for butterflies to rest and warm up. Oh, I just got the poll. So using flat stones for butterflies to rest and warm up. A lot of your pollinators are going to be cold-blooded. So they do like the sun, and they do like resting spots. So by creating, a little rock garden, you can kind of help them, warm up and keep moving. You could also use some sand and some little rocks to create little puddles, which is wet sand. It can be placed in a shallow pan, like you see this bird bath here, and kind of making the soil or the sand moist so that they can kind of siphon water, because they need to hydrate too. And fruit, you can provide fruit sources by planting different shrubs with berries and such like that. And then also in the summer, maybe you have a ripe watermelon or an overripe watermelon. Instead of throwing it in the compost, you could have it out. I have a really cool picture I should have included. I have a cool picture of a cantaloupe from last summer from our donation garden, and there was what butterfly was it? It was like a blue butterfly. It was beautiful. And it was sucking on the fruit juices of that cantaloupe. It was rotten, I think rodents had gotten into it, so it wasn't consumable for humans. And the butterfly was just siphoning off all the nectar and, the juice of the fruit. And it was able to use that to help sustain itself. So that was really fun to see. And then again, like I mentioned before about brush piles and old logs, you can see here to the right, there are logs with holes drilled in, and this is really good for our native bees. So a lot of our native bees, like I said before, are solitary bees, and they kind of just live in these little holes. They can lay their eggs in there, and it just helps create a little habitat for them in your yard. You don't need to do this whole thing with a bee hotel if you don't want, but just by providing, maybe an old log, drilling some holes into it. There's a really good book about mason bees that I can include, and that will kind of give you an idea of how to kind of create like a little bee habitat. Next. Okay. All right, so let's talk real quick about creating a native plant community by transplanting. So the transplanting is when you have an established little plant in a pot from a nursery, and you're going to plant it into your garden. So what you want to do to prepare your garden is to remove all invasive species. Some people may not have invasive species in their garden, which you're very lucky. Some may. I know I have English ivy and some of the invasive lonicera out there that you need to keep removing. And that's always going to happen. You're always going to have to, pull something out of the garden that you don't want because it finds a way. So if you're creating a new bed, you want to kind of prepare in the fall before planting, and you could do the lasagna method where you put newspaper or cardboard down, and then in between maybe some grass clippings or some leaves in between the layers, and then mulch on top about 2 to 3 inches to kill some sod. If you don't have any time and you want to do this spring, you can try to mulch about 2 to 3 inches and try to kill the sod that way. You might get some sod to poke through, but for the most part, you'll kill enough of the sod in order to plant your native plants. If you have to add topsoil because you have really terrible soil, like my Phil in the backyard, you can add some topsoil or compost even, but you don't want to add too much organic matter because native plants are already suited to your site if you select the right one, so you don't necessarily need to add more organic matter. Like I said, adding 3 inches of mulch can kind of suffocate the sod. And then if you have created that lasagna method in the fall, in the spring, you can just plant right into it. The newspaper and the compost will kind of have deteriorated and decomposed, and so you can just kind of plant right into it. And make sure that when you have your pot, say you have a gallon container, you want to make sure that the hole you dig for that plant is twice as wide and then just as deep. You don't want to dig too deep of a hole, because then that can compress into the soil, and you could cover kind of the crown of the plant. So you want to make sure that you just cover it, that you have the soil level of the pot continuous with the soil level in the ground. And when you're mulching, the mulch should not touch the stems of the plant. So create a little circle around, maybe about like 1 inch or 2 around the plant, so that the mulch doesn't touch the stems. All right. You can plant natives in containers. I saw a really great example of this, not this picture. It's a picture on my old phone, which I couldn't access, unfortunately. But in Asbury Park on the boardwalk, there was really cool planters with native plants all planted into it. And that was really attractive. Unfortunately, a planting like this may not last for multiple seasons, because a lot of these plants can tend to be really large. So your mountain mint's going to grow very big. Purple coneflower is going to be pretty large. The coreopsis would probably work, and maybe the oxeye sunflower and the side oats would be okay. But just kind of think of maybe some smaller plants, some smaller grasses that have more of a shallow root system. Maybe not something with a taproot, because that's going to go down pretty deep, but thinking about some larger containers for your landscape, if you want to try to plant natives in containers, because a lot of your natives are, they might have some deeper taproots. So just kind of consider, the root system when you're planting in containers. But it can be done. If you don't want to plant or maybe you have an apartment or something, you can still plant natives. So give it a try. All right, quick recap. There's so many things to consider when you're starting a native plant garden. But you really want to take the time to observe, make the observation of what's growing around you, what's growing in your yard, what's growing in your neighborhood, and consider your site conditions, your soil, your sun, the moisture level in the soil, very important. Then you want to take the time and do the research. Which plants are going to be best for your garden and your site? You want to target specific beneficial insects or bird species. Make sure you choose plants that will attract those species. And then just start small. You don't have to grow a big garden this year. If you just want to start with a few species kind of in an area and then grow from there, that's a great idea. You can also you also want to incorporate your herbaceous, your woodies, your grasses, and then also just experiment and have fun. Failure is the part of the process, so just go with it. Any questions? And there's Michelle there, and we're building our native plant nursery at the Earth Center, and she's ready to go.
Ready to go. Oh, Angela, that was great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I've had a hard time kind of getting psyched up about gardening, but this spring, but I am now.
Let's do it. Let's get out there.
Yes. All right. So let's go through these many questions.
Okay.
Before I go into that, folks, I neglected to mention something very important at the beginning. One is that we want to hear from you, especially folks that have been part of Earth Day Every Day, with us for a year now. We want to know what changes you have made at home. So we will be sending out a survey to you by email to find out what you have implemented from and learned from this Earth Day Everyday program. But also, if you care to, we started a hashtag. We're trying something new. So the hashtag is hashtag E2D2, and we'll put that in the chat. So you can post on social media with how you are making everyday Earth Day at home and some of the things that you've done. And you can take a picture of it and with the hashtag E2D2 and post it on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, wherever, and let us know all the cool things that you guys are doing at home to make everyday Earth Day. Okay, Angela.
Yes.
First of all, what is the is Echinacea purpurea native to New Jersey, or is it more from the Midwest?
It's it's more of a prairie flower. I think there is a little bit of debate about whether that is a New Jersey native. I would have to look that up because I know that there is some uh, some debate around that.
Right, right. Okay. Do deer repellents impact native plants or affect insects?
Not that I know of. The ones that I've used before are the more organic types that have more essential oils in them, so they're just kind of smelly. Sometimes they'll contain coyote urine, which wouldn't be detrimental to native plantings or anything. It's just really stinky. But there's all different types out there, and like I said, there are organic types that would be fine.
Okay. Okay, great. Also, we've had a bunch of requests to get a copy of the presentation. I just want everyone to know that the recording of this presentation will be put online at our Earth Day Everyday website. And as far as like a PDA, Angela, are you okay with I'm sorry, a PDF? Are you okay with sharing a PDF with folks
Um,
on this?
Yeah,
We
I guess
can,
I could. That probably wouldn't be a big deal.
okay, okay. Um, okay, another question. If planting with plugs, how many per square feet to achieve good cover? And
Ooh,
as a follow-up to that,
okay.
I was having a nice conversation with someone about something that you mentioned later in the presentation when you
Mm,
talked about the idea of green mulch.
yes.
I know you and I have had conversations about this, about more of a
Yeah.
European kind of approach to gardening.
Hmm.
So if you want to just kind of expand on that a little more.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess if you're considering plugs, plugs tend to be a smaller plant. So that might be like a first year plant after germinating. So plugs tend to be maybe like 2 inches or so, and they usually come in a flat um, with a lot of plants in them. So maybe like a tray of 50 or something or 100. And so those are going to be a lot smaller when you're trying to establish the garden, which is okay. But it really depends on the the species of plant. How big is that plant going to get? Like if it's Pennsylvania sedge, that could be, I don't know what, like 3 4 inch, like maybe like 2 3 feet wide. Whereas something like echinacea, sorry, I keep going back to echinacea, but it's just in my brain. That's going to get a lot wider. So you really have to know how wide the plants get. And then as far as creating green mulch, there's a lot of those ground covers out there, and low growing grasses that kind of can create the green mulch. So there is a native pachysandra that's really interesting that you could use as a ground cover. Like I said, a lot of, if you have a shadier site, maybe like underneath a tree, the Pennsylvania sedge is a really good one. And I mean, there's in more of a shady wet site, you could do wild ginger. That's really pretty, kind of in the spring.
Right.
And then heuchera is a good ground cover that is good for either dry or moist, shady to part shade sites. So there's a lot out there. So you just have to kind of, like I said, do the research.
Right, right. And you and I have had conversations in the past of this conventional idea of having a garden bed and it being plants, couple of plants with lots of mulch.
Yeah.
With people, it's a good idea to try to start getting away from that type of gardening.
Yeah, and I think mulch is good when you're first establishing your garden, um, because it helps prevent weeds. But
Right.
then as years go on, you kind of want to make sure that your plants are shading out the soil so that weed seeds don't germinate. So you'll need less and less mulch ideally as you kind of grow your native plant garden.
Okay. Okay. Since we're still talking about mulch, lots of questions about mulch. Do you have a recommendation on the best type of mulch? Um, we often recommend triple shredded hardwood mulch with no
Yeah,
dye.
that's
Okay.
great. And like cedar, I mean, cedar mulch is expensive, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, uh, yeah, just make sure that you're getting it from a reputable person and that it's not just trash mulch, because sometimes you can get, I mean, you can get free mulch from a lot of times from your municipality, but sometimes it has trash in it, and sometimes they grind up poison ivy in it. But I mean, just kind of use your judgment. A lot of times there's weed seeds in there, so you will have to pull out maybe some weeds or other invasives, but you just keep an eye out for it.
Okay. Question about mints. This individual knows that mints really spread. Does mountain mint spread a lot?
It does spread a little bit, but it's really not bad. I have it in a native plant garden at my grandparents' house, my first native plant garden, and it doesn't spread too bad, but it does get big. And yeah, so I mean, any sort of mint is going to kind of be a little bit more on the aggressive side, so you just have to kind of plan for that. Even Monarda is in the mint family, and that can kind of spread and move around a little bit. So, but I would say it's not, it's not terrible. It's not like spearmint, which
Okay.
is a pain.
Okay, great. Okay, now I'm just moving through these questions. We've learned that we should mulch under a tree to several feet away from the trunk, so there is no water competition. Should we do ground covering up to the trunk?
I would give it maybe like a foot or so, because if you try to plant too close to any roots or even to the what's that called, the root,
The flare.
the flare, thank you. You could kind of damage the roots if you try to dig too much, so try to plant a little bit away from the flare and the trunk.
Okay. Question about the resource sheet. We'll email out the resource sheet, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. What size holes in, oh, there's a question here that maybe I'm not getting. What size holes in the logs? Are you?
Oh, I think you'd have to look that up. I would have to look that up, to be honest, because I haven't built one, but there are a couple at the Earth Center that I've seen that were built by our Boy Scouts, our local troop. And there's a whole how-to. If you just typed in like native bee habitat or mason bee habitat, you could find the correct diameter that you would want to drill.
Okay, great. Okay, the ever-present question about deer.
Yeah.
Has a small woodland area and wants to plant native bushes, plants and trees. It has a lot of deer. Any recommendations on top natives that are deer resistant?
Sure, I guess native, you're saying shrubs?
Well,
Deer
looks
resistant
like
shrubs or just everything?
yeah. She's.
I know it's so hard because
It
they
is
really
hard.
they'll eat things that you don't think they're gonna eat.
Right. So Jersey Friendly Yards can be that their website can be very helpful for this. Just putting in that you're looking for deer resistant plants in your region. That's a good place to go. Mike Van Cleef there's a great presentation that he does. I think it's on YouTube. He's with the invasive species strike team. Has done a couple of presentations on deer resistant native plants. I can send that out in the resources. And then Rutgers does have a fact sheet on deer resistant plants, but know that a lot of stuff on there is not native. It's not my favorite fact sheet, although I believe it is the most downloaded fact sheet at Rutgers.
Interesting. That makes sense. There's a really big deer issue, so.
Yes.
That.
So, okay, next question. Any suggestions for getting rid of, a little off topic, any suggestions for getting rid of mile-a-minute weed?
Yeah, that's tough because mile a minute, even when the berries form, like when the fruit forms, the seed can drop and be viable, which is tough. So I would suggest maybe mowing it really early in the spring if you know where it is. Keep it mowed, and hopefully over time the plant will lose vigor and just try, pull it maybe, because I know a lot of times too, if you leave it be over the winter, you'll see it's kind of like you'll see the vines growing over the plants. So try to pull that and then trash it. Don't put it in your compost, but put it in a black trash bag and get rid of it. So I would maybe do that first and then just kind of mow that area where you see it. And hopefully over time it will die back. You could also try, you could try the cardboard and mulch method to suppress it. But kind of know that there is going to be a seed bank in there. So if you ever go to till the soil again, you might have those seeds germinate in the seed bank in the soil.
Okay.
So it's tough. I mean, yeah, you could spray herbicides, but I mean, not everyone really wants to do that.
Okay. Okay. If you have seeds from native plants, is it best to plant in fall or spring?
Ooh, well, it depends on the seed, but a lot of seeds need to be stratified, which means it needs a cooling, warm period, like usually a moist, cool period, in order to break the seed dormancy. So, so if you want to plant seeds in the fall, it can naturally go through that stratification process. Whereas if you have seeds now and you didn't have a chance to do that, you can get some peat moss or vermiculite, put the seeds in a little plastic baggie with moistened peat or vermiculite, and then label the bag so you know what it is, and then throw it in the back of your fridge for like a month or 60 days, and put the date on there and set a reminder to when to take those seeds out and then try to sow them into the ground. Not too deep because a lot of seeds need light to germinate, and see how that goes, because a lot of times they will need to have that cooling period.
Okay. Okay. So are there any not too far New Jersey native gardens that you would recommend viewing for inspiration?
I don't know about in New Jersey. I mean, we have the native plant garden at the Earth Center,
Right.
so that's a work in progress. I think maybe Rutgers Gardens has some native plants. I don't know if they have a dedicated native plant garden, but I know that they do incorporate native plantings. And then I really like the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware. I know it's Delaware, but it's not too far of a drive. I think it's maybe like 2 hours, 2.5 hours from central Jersey, and I love it. That's an amazing site, and they do a lot of research on native plant cultivars too, and what's beneficial for the pollinators.
Right. Right. Um, Another question, what do you think of native pollinator seed mixes offered by some heirloom seed suppliers?
I think it depends on what's in the mix. You really have to look at the species list and see what's in there to see what's actually native. Because I know a lot of pollinator mixes have some annuals as like fillers, and they are not native. They're exotic, not necessarily invasive. They're not bad, but they do sometimes incorporate some of those non-native filler annuals. But yeah, I would really just figure out, what your site conditions are. And then places like Michelle, does Pinelands offer seed mixes to the public?
They, I am not sure. They do have Pinelands Direct. That's
Yeah.
their retail arm, and folks could check
Yeah.
Pinelands Direct to see if they have seed mixes available.
Yeah. So I would just, if you're looking at already made mixes of native plant seeds, just know what your soil conditions are, if it's dry or wet, and then, go from there to see if those mixes will be right for your site.
Okay, okay. More questions coming in. If I want to plant native plants, would I be restricted to New Jersey natives, or would generally US natives be okay? That's a philosophical question right
It
there.
is. I think you would get a lot of different answers
You
from
would.
different people. Some people are really strict and like they have to be New Jersey natives, and others are, a little bit more far-reaching as far as, what plants they consider, natives. It's, I think as long as it has an ecological value and the plant fits to your site and it's not invasive well, it wouldn't be invasive, but it's not too aggressive in our area, then I think it should be okay. I mean, you might get a plant, if you live by the beach, you might get a plant that you could grow like from, I don't know, from like southern, or from like, Central California or something. It depends. I mean, you really have to consider the site conditions. What's the soil like? What's your light level like from the sun? How much light do you get? So I mean, just gotta try it, gotta experiment.
Okay. What should folks watch out for or be careful with when combining native and non-native plants in a garden?
I would consider spread as far as how wide the plants get in your new planting, and just kind of thinking again about how tall the plants get, how deep the root systems are, because plants are going to compete with each other regardless. So you just want to kind of think about how it's going to interact with your established plantings. Um, you want to just make sure that they're just going to give each other enough space.
Mhm.
So just doing the research and figuring out how wide the plant gets, how tall it gets, so that you're not planting a short plant behind a tall plant and things like that. I don't think you have to worry about anything too drastic though.
Okay. Can you plant native shrubs in the fall?
You can. It wouldn't be a bad time to plant, just as long as the soil is still workable and the plant has a little bit of time to get established. I mean, it's spring's preferable, but if you do it, say in September, and make sure it's watered, because September's been pretty dry in the last few years. So just as long as the plant can kind of establish its roots and it's not too hot, if you did it in early September, you'd probably be okay.
Okay. Okay. Some other comments coming in. One, someone saying that Pinelands Direct does have seed mixes for all types of soil types and needs. Hopefully it's available through retail. Another comment that the Rutgers Cooperative Extension offices in Monmouth County in Freehold, they have a native garden on their grounds also that
Great,
folks
thank
could
you.
go and visit.
Awesome.
Okay. And then Pennsylvania has a native seed company, or Ernst Seed Company.
Yeah, I thought Ernst though was just wholesale, but I'm not 100% sure, because
Okay.
we've ordered from them before, but
Right.
because I didn't mention them because I'm pretty sure they're mostly wholesale, but
Okay.
they might have a retail aspect, and that would be another great resource.
Okay. Okay. And this may be our last question, because
Okay.
we'll keep you here all night, Angela. But for the sake of pollinators and beneficials, what is a good time to rake out leaves and debris from garden beds that were left over the winter?
Yeah, I would say in the beginning of spring, so in a couple weeks, maybe like middle to end of March is a good time to clean up your native plant garden and kind of, you can compost things, you can add it to your brush pile, and it would be better if you made a little brush pile instead of putting it to the curb, because then, if there are still some beneficials, overwintering, or their eggs are, in the brush, they would end up in your yard as opposed to in the landfill. So as much as you can, compost it or just keep it on your property, as long as it's not invasive and there's weed seeds.
Okay. Okay. Great. Other comments coming in. Bowman's Hill is a great place to see native plants.
True.
That's over in Pennsylvania. And then Cumberland County, Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Cumberland County has a butterfly and pollinator garden, which is
awesome.
mostly native.
Great.
Okay, I think that's a great way to end. So I am going to, well, I'll wait to stop the recording. All right, folks. Well, first of all, thank you, Angela, so much. That was fabulous. A great way to start off the Earth Day Everyday webinar series. Couple of things before closing out. The poll looks like lots and lots of people. I'm going to end the poll because it looks like lots of people already filled that out. Thank you for doing that. So a reminder that we will be here for about 8 weeks every Monday at 6:30. Next week is on March 15th at 6:30 is we'll be with Doug Zemeckis. I lost my page. Hold on a second. Doug Zemeckis, who's our marine extension agent, and he'll be talking about responsible stewardship of New Jersey's marine resources. So what everybody can do to protect the New Jersey shore. Also, before we go, I want to, again, I think somebody put it in the chat, but I wanted to again say that these sessions are free, but if you are feeling generous, you can donate to our program. And I will go ahead and put that information in the chat so that you have it. If you have donated in the past, thank you so much. Folks were very generous last year. We appreciated. The funding goes to internships, scholarships, and supplies for the Rutgers Environmental Stewards Program. And I think with that, we will say goodnight to everybody. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. I'm going to stop the recording.